In the 1990s, Konami were an unstoppable force in the video game market. Between the success of their Castlevania and Metal Gear series, along with many other titles like Contra and Suikoden, Konami were living the high life. However, one of Konami's most famous and influential series would only see the light of day in 1999, and would go on to shape the landscape of survival horror for years to come. This game was of course Silent Hill on the PlayStation 1. Silent Hill would go on to become one of Konami's staple franchises, and while the series changed along the way as new teams and directors took on the IP, the original 3 Silent Hill games are considered some of the best horror games ever made, even this many years later. However, a series spanning so many games starts with very humble beginnings. The development of Silent Hill 1 began in 1996 alongside Metal Gear Solid by an internal development team known as Team Silent. The team was made up of members of other teams that had been unsuccessful in their projects. This meant the team was very disjointed, leading to a long and arduous development process. The game would take about 3 years to complete and went through many changes before release. The main competitor in the horror game market was of course Capcom's highly successful Resident Evil, which released the same year Silent Hill began development. As the team began to settle into the project, they opted for a more story-based approach, as opposed to Resident Evil's campy, tongue-in-cheek style. The idea was to make the game more eerie and psychological, toying with the player's fear of the unknown, and tell a story that could age well. This direction would prove to be a good decision, seeing the impact that Silent Hill has had on the horror genre so many years later. However, it was a lot riskier. While the team got started implementing their ideas, one member of the team in particular had a strained relationship with Konami. One of the most important members of Team Silent at the time was a man named Takeo Sato. Being a young member of Konami, his bosses and higher-ups showed him very little respect despite his talent. He was mostly assigned to font design and small 3D presentations, which he received no credit for. Originally, he wasn't assigned to Team Silent, but instead forced his way onto the team by showing the higher-ups at Konami a 4-second 3D demo reel, and threatened to withhold the method of creating it from the rest of the company. Giving in to his demands, he was assigned the position of character designer for Silent Hill. However, the story doesn't end there. Once he began working on the 3D cinematic FMVs for the game, his superiors attempted to assign him a supervisor. At the time, Japanese companies were against giving credit to young members of their team. However, Sato was having none of it. In a dispute with his boss, he claimed that he could make all of the FMVs by himself, and was left alone. "I didn't go home for 3 years almost. I lived there. I slept under the desk, and that midnight time I talked about, after everyone went home, was a real chance for me to work." It's very clear even to this day that Silent Hill's CG movies were leagues above the competition, and that was all due to the dedication of one man. But Silent Hill was much more than just a pretty face. The lead director and writer, Keiichiro Toyama, admits to not being much of a horror fan back when he was first assigned to work on Silent Hill. Instead, Toyama's major influences came from the works of directors like David Lynch, which makes a lot of sense. The town of Silent Hill is based on an American town as interpreted by a Japanese development team, where creepy events unfold. A lot of Lynch's most popular works, from Twin Peaks to Mulholland Drive, take place in these kinds of settings. Beyond just the setting, the lore of Silent Hill fits more in line with a Lynchian horror than the B-movie inspirations of Resident Evil. The game would feature a more psychological approach to horror, with the town of Silent Hill constantly switching between a snowy, abandoned ghost town to a nightmarish otherworld. The player would control Harry Mason, who seems to have accidentally become wrapped up in the mess currently occurring in Silent Hill. So, once the stage of the story was set, the game began to come together. While the PlayStation was one of the most powerful home consoles ever made at the time, it still had very clear limitations, especially when it came to 3D. Silent Hill, while not being the best looking PlayStation game, definitely has a lot of both content and style. The iconic fog of Silent Hill has become a staple in the franchise. However, it began as a response to gameplay limitations. The draw distance, basically the amount of the environment around the player that's shown on screen, is tiny in the original Silent Hill. Even with the flashlight, the player can only see a couple of feet in front of them at any given time. This of course meant that the PlayStation had to load a lot fewer polygons at any given time, meaning that the environments and textures could be a lot higher quality. In an interview around the time of Silent Hill 2's release, the system programmer for the original Silent Hill, Akira Yamaoka, talks about the use of fog in these games. The fear of not being able to see what's really ahead or around you is something that really disturbs human beings. That's why we need to use the flashlight. Also, even on the PS2, this effect can help us accomplish things graphically. If we cut down on the number of polygons, we can use better textures. This makes things look better. So, there's another reason. So what started as a gameplay limitation actually helped to reinforce the horror that makes Silent Hill so memorable. Similarly, the combat in the first Silent Hill game is clunky. The player can use a number of different melee weapons and firearms to defeat the monsters that get between Harry and his objective. However, the controls are very limited. For one, the aiming is very stiff, and locking onto enemies can sometimes still result in Harry's shots completely missing. For melee weapons, a lot of the stronger weapons like the hammer force Harry to stand in one spot and not move while swinging at enemies. The effort that it takes to defeat enemies helps to reinforce two main ideas. 1. Harry Mason is a civilian. Harry is not a soldier. He's not a member of an elite task force sent in to save the residents of Silent Hill. He's just some guy. While later Silent Hill games would add intricate combat systems, the first 4 all have a very distinct stiffness, because all of the protagonists are normal people. The second thing this does is makes the player choose to fight or flight. There are a limited number of bullets and weapons in Silent Hill, and a lot of the time, the player is expected to explore the streets on the way to different objectives to find them. Running out of bullets is a real threat, and there aren't enough bullets in the game to kill every single enemy. Therefore, sometimes you need to choose the option to sneak past enemies, or just flat out run away from them. The game uses 3D environments, however it also uses a lot of cinematic camera angles. While the player can center the camera with L2 most of the time, they'll be shown a fixed view of the room they're in. To combat this, the game uses tank controls, which was also used in the original Resident Evils. Basically, the forward button on the D-pad allows the player to walk in the direction Harry is facing, regardless of the camera angle. This means that when the game suddenly switches camera angle, the character doesn't lurch in the direction the camera is facing, and allows the character to keep on their path. While this takes a while to get used to, it still limits the player's movements and keeps them on edge. Even once you fully grasp the controls, it's unwieldy at best. But much like the weapons, it forces the player to be careful and stay on edge at all times. The camera itself also allows the game to be a lot scarier by using cinematic tricks to unnerve the player. The limitations of player control and rendering technology in Silent Hill is quite literally making the best of a bad situation, and the team liked it so much that they became a part of the franchise. Before we talk about the finished product though, there are 2 more members of Team Silent that you'll have to get used to hearing about. The first of these is obviously Masahiro Ito, the monster designer for the first 3 Silent Hill games. Ito's work is extremely important to the soul of Silent Hill, bringing his very specific brand of monster design. His role during the first Silent Hill was background designer, however he did design monsters alongside Keiichiro Toyama. Ito's monsters are always designed with a specific story and characters in mind, adding to the psychological aspects of Silent Hill. For example, in Silent Hill, all of the monster designs are based on the life and experiences of Alessa Gillespie. Enemies like the Air Screamers are inspired by her favourite book, The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle. The iconic puppet nurses represent Alessa's distrust of nurses due to the time that she spent in hospital. Her hatred and disgust for bugs inspire a lot of the enemies like the Hanged Scratcher, the Wormhead, and the Creeper. It's impossible to know which monsters in the first game Ito designed, but it's very clear that the idea of monsters reflecting a character's psyche is something that would shape the rest of the franchise, once Ito became the main monster designer in 2 and 3. His art style and design choices are the lifeblood of Silent Hill's monsters, proving that even the generic enemies in a game can be tied into the themes and story. The final member of Team Silent that I want to mention is of course the composer and sound designer Akira Yamaoka. Yamaoka has the largest involvement of any member of Team Silent, staying on Silent Hill well after the team disbanded after Silent Hill 4. His work in the Silent Hill series cannot be understated, as his unique style of haunting music sets the atmosphere for a lot of the areas in the game. While the soundtrack is very melancholic and uses a lot of background noise, it's not discordant. A lot of the main themes are very melodic, such as the heartbreaking melody of Lisa's theme, and the beautifully creepy mandolin of the opening theme. However, while exploring the streets of Silent Hill, the music is very low-key, relying mostly on the sound effects of the world to unnerve the player. His music uses a lot of ambient drones, however, a lot of the soundtrack tries to keep some sort of melody. That is, until the boss fight music comes along. Yamaoka's music is very experimental, and tracks like Ain't Gonna Rain and My Heaven are perfect examples of this. The intense percussion that sounds like someone is banging on metal grates puts the player completely on edge, and any semblance of melody is completely cut down. My Heaven in particular is interesting, as the main instrument used isn't actually an instrument, but samples of a dentist's drill. Now that we've looked at most of the important members of Team Silent, it's time to see how the game turned out after an almost 3-year-long development cycle. The story of Silent Hill begins very simply. One day, Harry Mason and his daughter Cheryl decide to take a vacation to the resort town of Silent Hill. However, on their way into town, Harry sees a young girl crossing the street and swerves to dodge her, crashing his car in the process. Once he wakes up, he finds that Cheryl has gone missing, and the town of Silent Hill seems abandoned. Refusing to leave without his daughter, Harry ventures into the town, following any clues he can to get his daughter back. Along the way, he meets a number of characters that seem to be experiencing the same nightmare that he is, from the police officer Sybil Bennett to the nurse Lisa Garland. As Harry gets closer to finding his daughter, he begins to uncover the secrets of the town, mainly surrounding a cult known as the Order and a drug problem that the police in Silent Hill can't seem to stop. Unlike later Silent Hill games, Harry is a very passive protagonist, almost as if he's meant to be a self-insert for the player. There are a few reasons why I believe this. Firstly, his general demeanor is very plain. He doesn't react as aggressively to the events around him as he probably should. Instead, he constantly focuses on finding his daughter. When compared to characters like Heather from Silent Hill 3, he shows very little emotion. Secondly, the game doesn't focus on him as a character. I mentioned earlier how every monster in the game is designed around the psyche of a character. In Silent Hill 2 and 3, the monsters are based on the lives of James Sunderland and Heather Mason respectively, both of which are the protagonists of their games. Silent Hill, on the other hand, bases the monsters on another character, Alessa Gillespie, showing us that Harry is actually trespassing on another person's nightmare, as opposed to journeying through his own. Thirdly, we know very little about Harry, and what little we learn about him doesn't tell us a lot about his character. We know that his wife died a few years previous to the events of Silent Hill, and that his daughter Cheryl is actually adopted after he and his wife found her in a field. The manual tells us that Harry is a writer, but other than that, we know very little about his profession. Things like the novelization of Silent Hill and the Silent Hill play novel on GBA have attempted to characterize him further, but I believe the original version in Silent Hill was intentionally vague. I assume that this was done to allow players to immerse themselves in the town instead of watching someone else's story unfold like in later games. The feeling of confusion as you uncover the story matches Harry's confusion, as he is completely unaware of what's going on as well. The main gameplay loop of Silent Hill is very simple. For a PS1 game, the map of Silent Hill is actually quite large, so the player must navigate the foggy streets to find clues on Cheryl's location. Once the player finds something, that will usually lead them into a building that they must solve puzzles in to find a key item or open a door, which will then lead them into a new section of town. However, the town of Silent Hill isn't as compliant as you would hope. Areas like Midditch Elementary School involve Harry exploring the building twice, as after one full sweep, the game switches into the other world. The nightmare that has been created by the young girl, Alessa Gillespie, manifests not only in the monsters that roam the streets, but also in a shift in the town. The concrete streets are replaced by metal grates. The snow and grey is replaced by darkness and a tinge of red. The rules of reality don't apply in the other world. While you may think going through the same dungeon more than once is boring, while the layout stays the same, all of the puzzles are completely changed, and the atmosphere becomes haunting. Silent Hill uses a lot of really interesting tricks, most of which occur in the Otherworld, to confuse the player. My favourite of which is in Midditch Elementary Otherworld. If the player enters the bathroom on the first floor, they'll find very little and leave the way they came in. Once the player reaches the hallway again, they'll find that a grate blocks the hallway that was previously open. If the player checks their map, they'll find out that they've actually been teleported to the second floor bathrooms, and by going back in through the second floor toilet, they can return to the first floor. It's that initial moment of bewilderment that throws the player off their game. Another way in which the game throws you off is through the radio. Another iconic piece of the Silent Hill formula, the radio emits a static noise when enemies are nearby, increasing in pitch and volume as they get closer. Going back to Imamura's comments about not being able to see what's in front of you, the radio ties into this fear. You can hear enemies coming far sooner than you can see them through the fog, which gives an anticipation to every encounter, especially when standing still and hearing the static grow louder and louder. The final piece of the Silent Hill formula that I want to talk about is the flashlight. Mentioned briefly earlier, the flashlight is intended to help the player have at least slightly better visibility in the fog and in dark corridors. However, much like with the weapons, the game forces you to consider whether using it is such a good idea. Almost every enemy in the game reacts to light, and once they see your light, they will gun straight for you. However, if you were to enter the room completely dark, most enemies won't react unless you run directly into them. It's a balancing act. Do you draw attention to yourself and allow yourself to see what's coming, or do you take your chances wandering blindly through the dark, hoping you don't bump into an enemy that you can't see, with the sound of radio static as your only guide? It's interesting how, at least for the Team Silent games, the gameplay changes very little between any of them. It gets slightly more refined, and a couple new mechanics get added, but all in all, Silent Hill 1 sets the foundation that the rest of the games follow. While the first game might not have the most in-depth story or as hard-hitting a narrative as the other two games I'll be discussing, it most certainly is the scariest, at least to me. There's something about the PS1 era aesthetic that makes the game's atmosphere more oppressive than that of its sequels. Moments like this, while being completely unable to harm Harry, are why I believe Silent Hill is the scariest game in the series, or at the very least, has me on edge the most when I play it. As I mentioned earlier, Silent Hill is not quite as narratively driven as later games in the franchise, instead relying more on gameplay to create a true horror experience. However, that's not to say that the plot doesn't have anything going for it. The most integral character to understand the plot and point of this game isn't our protagonist, but Alessa Gillespie. I've mentioned her a few times already, but haven't actually told you anything about her. Alessa was a young girl who lived alone with her mother Dahlia. We meet Dahlia throughout the game, and she's, well...
I've been expecting you. It was foretold by gyromancy. The path of the hermit concealed by Flauros.
Strange, to say the least. We find out as the game goes on that the ghostly girl that we've been following around and seeing is actually Alessa herself, or what's left of her anyways. Dahlia is an avid member of the cult in Silent Hill, and in case you thought she was just an avid churchgoer, she actually uses her daughter as a surrogate mother for the god of the order. However, something goes wrong and Alessa is split into two. One half stayed in Silent Hill and lived a fate worse than death in an endless nightmare, while the second half became a baby which Harry Mason and his wife found outside Silent Hill and named Cheryl. This is the gist of the mystery in Silent Hill, or at least it's the important bits. The important key to understanding the actual world of the game, however, is Alessa. A lot of the areas in the game are key locations in Alessa's early childhood. The first major building you visit is Midditch Elementary School, where Alessa enrolled. In the final areas of the game, we find a school table with horrible threats etched into it, implying that Alessa spent a lot of her school life as an outcast, being bullied by her peers. The second biggest area in the game is Alchemilla Hospital, run by Dr. Kaufman. Here, the player discovers a basement with a picture of Alessa, which we later discover is where she was kept for the 7 years that she was split from Cheryl and a housed god. Another location, Green Line Antique Store, is owned by her mother Dahlia and contains a secret passageway to a secret altar. Almost every important area in the game has some connection to Alessa, which is not surprising, especially since she's the one currently turning the town into a living nightmare. Alessa is not the villain, despite what Dahlia tells Harry in the beginning of the game. She is merely taking the one opportunity she has to take revenge on the town that ruined her life. The final boss of the game, which can either be the Incubator or the Incubus depending on actions the player takes, clearly shows who the true villain is. The first to appear is the Incubator, given this name because it is literally an incubator for the god of the order. The boss appears once Cheryl and Alessa reunite, and shows us Alessa's image of what a god looks like. Saintly white robes bathed in a glowing light. Killing this boss results in one of the two bad endings, where Harry is unable to save his daughter. However, in the two good endings, Dr. Kaufman uses a liquid called Aglopitus to expel the demon from the incubator, revealing the Incubus. This is the true god of the Order, and represents Dahlia's mental image of a god. The much darker, goat-like appearance is very reminiscent of Baphomet, a pagan entity who has been around for centuries. In the good endings, once the Incubus has been destroyed, Harry discovers that the incubator still contains Alessa's consciousness in some form, as she hands Harry a baby, which is implied to be the reincarnation of Alessa and Cheryl, allowing her another chance to live a normal life. This proves to us that Alessa is vengeful, yet not evil, since once the Incubus and Dahlia are dead, she has no reason to be angry. If you thought that the Incubus and Baphomet connection is just a coincidence, then you'd be wrong. Silent Hill and the Order especially are filled with influences from real-life religions. For example, the seal that Harry sees all throughout Silent Hill is referred to as both the Seal of Metatron and the Mark of Samael by Dahlia at different points in the game, both of which are references to archangels Metatron and Samael from Judaism. The item that Harry is led to believe will save the town from Alessa is known as the Flauros, which refers to a demon from the Hierarchy of Demons written by Johann Weyer in the 16th century. The Order are extremely important to the lore of Silent Hill, and are responsible for a lot of each game's events. Because of this, we learn more and more about them as time goes on. However, in the original Silent Hill, it's very clear that the Order are a demon-worshipping cult with some sort of grounding in Judeo-Christian beliefs. But we'll be taking another look at the Order in a later video, so let's leave it here for now. I don't want you all sitting here thinking Silent Hill is just a depressing and bleak look into the life of an abused young girl and a demon-worshipping cult, so I want to include a section in each of these videos where we let the games let loose. You see, while each game has multiple endings, each of them also has secret joke endings. Some are notorious, and for good reason, some of them even link together to form their own canon. According to an interview with Takeo Sato, there was a suggestion box during the development of the first game, which asked members of the team to answer the question, why did Silent Hill go into such a mess? One of the answers they got was alien conspiracy. So, the team liked it so much that they decided to make a joke ending only unlocked when the player had a save file with all 4 other endings on it and used a mysterious item called the Channeling Stone in 5 locations around the game. In this ending, Harry calls down an alien spaceship, and when face to face with literal grey aliens, Harry says exactly what you'd expect.
Let me ask you, have you seen a little girl around here?
While the joke endings become more complex and funny as the games go on, there's one big reason why I consider this to be one of my favorites, and it's very simple. If you've ever wanted to describe Harry Mason, this is the perfect way to do it. He's so dead set on finding his daughter that even in the face of alien life forms, the only thing he can say is,
have you seen a little girl around here?
This ending also deserves credit for inspiring the trend that each game would follow, but also for having the best song in the soundtrack. After the release of Silent Hill, Team Silent cemented themselves as a brilliant team. The game reviewed well and sold enough copies to receive the garish green label of PlayStation's greatest hits. While the game released in the middle of the original Resident Evil trilogy, many reviewers saw it as a very different style of horror. The emphasis on lighting, atmosphere, and psychological tricks has influenced so many horror games that to this day it remains one of the most important horror games of all time. Never mind the fact that it spawned countless sequels. Silent Hill is clunky. It's not exactly pretty by today's standards, and it's definitely got some issues with its voice acting, but at the end of the day, it's a seminal work of horror, one that I still find myself going back to all this time later. And that's it for part 1 of this 3-part Halloween special on Silent Hill. In the next part, I'll be tackling Silent Hill 2, and looking at how the generation switch between PS1 and PS2 allowed Team Silent to do things they never could. If you enjoyed this video, then I would very much appreciate you sticking around. I've put a lot of effort into getting these videos out for October, and if you enjoyed it and know any Silent Hill fans, then why not share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. But that's all I have time for. Enjoy the next video on Silent Hill 2, and I'll see you when I see you.